Good morning, afternoon, evening, or even night, everyone. Welcome to Mobiconf, and welcome to this presentation on effective pull request reviews. Today, I want to share some thoughts about my learnings in pull requests and their reviews, and hopefully you'll learn a thing or two, and hopefully this will lead to your code base becoming just a little better and a bit more secure for the future. So who am I? Just to start us off, my name is Bas. I'm here. Hello. And yeah, I care a lot about accessibility, and I actually worked at Apple on the macOS accessibility team up until recently, and it's just something that I keep in mind with all the things I do. So you might see a thing or two that has influenced the way I review pull requests and I write my pull requests myself in terms of accessibility. I think a big part of code is also its testability. Often we talk about having tests for our code, which, I think many would agree on is a good thing, but it's not always as easy to get there. So, testability is something I care about. And again, like accessibility is something we'll see back later in this presentation. I care a lot about communication and collaboration. Yeah, all of these things you'll see back, and they are the reason I talk about this topic. I also like watches, which, specific thing, just wearing the Apple Watch right now, but I also really like mechanical watches. So now you know a little bit more about me. Let's dive into this. So, effective pull request reviews. What are they? What are we talking about when we talk about effective pull request reviews? Well, you could say that they're kind of a developer playground. As a developer, we'll be spending quite a bit of time on pull request reviews, I hope. But yeah, they're a playground. They are a way for us to get together and understand how we're working, understand what we're working on, and just like push it this level forward. So treat them like that. And I think also they're quite a unique way that you can work together as a team, where pull requests do not exist in the finance world. Sure, you might have auditors or people checking, but it's quite a unique thing. And I've come to realize that, and it makes it wonderful to be able to do pull request reviews and learn from each other and share knowledge. So yeah, keep in mind that it's quite a unique possibility in our field to have this extra level of collaboration. And I think as a whole, it's good to take a look at pull requests as like, I've written my code, I've opened a pull request, or your colleague has written some code and opened a pull request. And the pull request and its review is where we go from your code to our code. And this is not just the pull request. Things like linting come to mind, style guides. Like there's probably documentation on any team that you'll join, or you might have even written that documentation for the team that you're on, to have that idea of like, how do we build our software? But the pull request is where you can really make sure that's happening, and I think that's great. And with that code becoming our code, we have this shared responsibility over our code, over the future of our code. And hopefully we'll see that, making sure that having the shared responsibility and caring about what we're building will lead to better code, to fewer bugs, to happier customers, it will just, improve the way we work. All right, so before we dive into reviews, part of this, kind of they're the same thing. To have a proper review, you want an effective pull request. And I think most of us are thinking about this one day where we had a huge feature branch, or doing some kind of cleanup that touched so many files in our code base, or seeing this one odd thing and just fixing that in the same pull request. And where sometimes that's fine, and based on how you do commits, etc., it'll be completely transparent and not an issue. But then sometimes you make these kind of changes, and trying to review that pull request becomes super tricky. Just wanted to go over some things to make sure that you have a pull request that can effectively be reviewed. And we're working with Git here, so if things go wrong and if you want to change things, that's always possible. So I think that's also good to keep in mind. Don't be afraid, but do keep in mind and have a bit of a feeling of what you're doing and why. So yeah, as said, it goes both ways. If we want to have proper reviews, we want to also take care of the way we build our pull requests. And with that, it becomes two powers in one, and that's what allows us to, do the best at both things, and then make the best review and have, the most useful takeaways from that review. If you have a pull request, keep it to the point. And it's kind of a tricky one, because you can say a whole feature in one feature branch is one point. It's kept to the point. And there's also, on the other hand, there's exceptions to this, where you might do one stylistic change for the file because there were some lint configuration changes, or it's an old file that wasn't there before the linter, and then you want to add that. But make sure that you think about this, and as we'll later see, describe it, and figure out how to make that structure reflected in, for example, Git commits, so that it's easier to review. But ideally you keep it short and small. But I think this also always depends on what kind of extra things come with a review and with a pull request. Does it have to run all your integration checks, etc.? So you might want to think about that as well. I think ideally more smaller pull requests is always nicer, but I think in practice that might not always be the case, and I think as a team you'll be able to figure out when that is and when it isn't, and sometimes you'll make a small mistake and it'll still be fine, and hopefully you'll learn from it and reflect on it. Code, tests, documentation. I gave a talk on this a few years ago, and I made this joke of code, tests, documentation, just like when the iPhone was announced, a phone, a widescreen iPod, and a broadband internet communicator. And apart from it trying to be funny, I think it is interesting, right? This adds context to your pull request. If you have your code, great. If you have your documentation explaining what this code is doing and why you've done certain things, explaining your thought process, that will really help. Tests can also help reason about the code and understand edge cases, etc. So while this is kind of irrelevant to some extent, I think it's a good one to keep in mind. And if you can, add your tests and add your documentation, and your code base will become better because of it. And on top of that, like I just said, explain your thought process. And this is perfect when you do this in documentation, because arguably you get the documentation for free. And this is also like, is the pull request broken up by commit, for example, like we previously mentioned. And also make sure you write a good ticket, you write a good description of your pull request. And speaking of which, I think this is always, with whatever your pull request is about, a crucial part of your description. How can we test this, right? Not just for a certain QA to test it, but maybe for yourself to run through it again, for a colleague that might be interested to like run this feature or run this UI change, or even just to understand what the pull request is about. And this can also be super interesting in the future, right? Like if a feature breaks, you can reference this again, you can test it, and with that, and hopefully the rest of the information in the ticket, you can reason about what may have broken or why this may have broken, and then go reason about how to fix it as well. And on top of that, hopefully building your feature, building your change, whatever you did in your pull request, you have tested it. So, might as well just write down what you did. Especially with UI changes, visual changes, visualize them. Add an image, add a GIF, add a movie explaining the change or the animation or whatever. And it will just really help give clarity to what's being done. And also assume best intentions. I mean, I've written questionable code before that, I maybe even realized was questionable after looking at it again. I have overlooked mistakes. I've introduced bugs. That happens. Be kind, approach a review positively, and anything, if possible, like approach it positively, like change that mindset, and it will improve the rest that is to come. And also manage expectations. Again, quite an evergreen thing, make sure that there is understandings of how your team creates pull requests, does reviews, and I think one of them as well is like, how long do we expect a review to take? And all of that comes together with the good thing of all of this being on the internet, all of this being asynchronous communication. You don't need to have a synchronous call for every pull request. And, it would probably not be great if you would need that. Although, as we see later, if needed, that might also be a good idea to propose having a chat with the person that wrote the code if there's a lack of understanding or something like that. When it comes to pull request reviews, I use a certain few guiding rules, I would say, that really make me get the most out of them. And one of those is soaking up knowledge. Pull requests are how I learn for most, for a big part, how I learn about the code base, how I learn about my colleagues, how to make sure that I can be more useful in the team and share more information, etc. So I think soaking up knowledge is a big, important part of pull requests. To do that, a very good start to understanding a pull request and making sure you can review it properly is to review the ticket and the pull request description. And take your time for that. Before you look at any code, try to get an understanding, try to get a visualization, however it is you work, of what you're going, what you're expecting to see in terms of code. And then, if that's not the case, you can reflect on it and say like, oh, this is not what I was expected for these and these reasons, and go from there, right? So reading the ticket and the description, great start. Might take some time. I think it's worth it. Then the second thing, and perhaps the most important thing to do, if you ask me, is to ask questions. many of them, and even more of them. If you see some code that that introduces something that you haven't seen before, ask about it, question it. Not necessarily reject it. That's not what we're doing here in reviews, hopefully. But make sure that, we make this code ours, and you, and also future you and others can understand what's happening. And I think oftentimes there's certain things that we don't really realize or skip over in terms of, what are we using, what kind of code are we writing, and what we might take for granted, what I might take for granted might be something completely new to you. And I might not realize that I've written it in a way that is not as easy to understand. And, having that question asked to me can also really help me understand, okay, why can this be confusing and how can we improve it? I don't do this always, but especially for bigger pull requests, I really like to, once I have a pull request up, to go through that code, ideally within that environment that others would review in, whether that be GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever tool you're using, and read through the code, right? You took a step away from the IDE and you take a look at the code, and I've caught bugs or just things that I was, wanting to point out and say like, hey, I've done, I've used map here or used filter here. Is that actually the most efficient? Like, is that how we do these things? So apart from catching issues, it can also really help to make sure you prepare your pull request to ask questions to the reviewer. And on the other hand, if you post a review, if you review a pull request, go over that review before you post it. Look at the question you've asked, look at the things you've pointed out, look at the good things you've pointed out, and try to take a step back and think of yourself as someone else reading this. Is it all understandable? It certainly happened to me where somebody would ask like, hey, what did you mean with this comment? And then I looked at my own comment and was like, well, I don't really know. And rereading a review has definitely helped catch these kind of things and just make the whole process easier. So apart from soaking up knowledge, pull request reviews are also a great way to share knowledge, and to point things out and to learn from each other. And it's really those two things that make pull requests so great for me: soaking up knowledge and sharing knowledge. So let's take a look at how and where we can share knowledge. First, provide context. If you're pointing something out, if you're asking about something that you've seen done in a different way, for example, provide context. For instance, if I come across a struct that only serves as a namespace in Swift, I wouldn't only suggest to use a caseless enum, but explain why I think that is the case. A caseless enum has a non-accessible initializer by default, while a struct can still be initialized without a private init. And having that context immediately takes away ambiguity and makes the pull request author understand why you're suggesting this. And heck, it may even make it easier for them to actually include that change, which is not always something that must happen or is expected to happen of all your pull request review comments. And you can even go a step further, or sometimes this is not even a step further but a side step, and that's to provide references, provide further reading, provide that link to something that explains it. If the person knows about it, they can just leave it unread, but this can really help someone else looking at the review and not knowing what's going on, or again, if you look at this again in the future, having this kind of context, having this kind of references can really help. And whether this reference is a blog post or a piece of code or documentation, link it, right? Like, you've looked at it, you know about this reference. Why omit it, right? Why omit this extra information? In the example about the caseless enum from just now, I would link to a blog post explaining the advantages of this caseless enum. And that allows the author again to dig deeper into the topic if they want, and might be helpful for those who read the comments in the future. Talking about comments and documentation, just wanting to take a little sidestep. If you add documentation, use a double slash for things that explain why we're doing something. Use a triple slash to explain what this is doing. Could also be summarized as the double slash being, code comments, and triple slash is header documentation, and actually will also be used as such, where it can generate, your documentation automatically. But if you're explaining why we did something, for example, there may only be a maximum of 10 people entering, this through this door within 10 minutes. Why is that? And then you might be able to reference to something in the back end or whatever, but that's not really explaining what something is doing, because that logic will probably just be below that comment. So let's take a look at a function where we create a UI alert controller and we add some things to it. In this case, we can add an image and we can add a check mark. And we see that this starts with triple slashes, and then later on it has double slashes, where the triple slashes explain what it creates and returns an action with the specified title and behavior. And the double slashes explain why we're doing something. In this case, setting the values for specific keys, as there's no explicit API available. If you didn't know that, you might look at this and be like, well, why are we set value for key rather than just accessing these properties? Well, the comment here explains it. All right, so we've talked about pull requests. We've talked about reviews in terms of soaking up knowledge and about sharing knowledge. What else? This might be obvious for some. It certainly isn't really for me, because when I talk about a pull request, my mind immediately thinks of code. But pull requests are for much more. I've written the book chapter through Git and pull requests. I've written a lot of documentation. You name it. So think about using pull requests and using Git for reviews that are not code. Your style guide, your linter information, maybe certain discussions on architecture, etc. And you can apply these same rules here. Use your reviews to make it better and to make your documentation our documentation. And again, as previously mentioned, if certain things are unclear, if you have trouble reviewing a pull request, often what you might want to do is just be honest about it and figure out what's going on and have an in-person review. And obviously with an in-person review, I mean a review over a video call, at least probably for another while and for the last quite a lot of time. But the point still stands, the thing still applies. An interesting thought experience you might want to do is to treat your pull requests as if it were open source. What would you do differently? What if others are reading along? What if others can reference it or use it to help understand the code base? What if people stumble upon it when troubleshooting? And kind of all the things that we've talked about apply here, where this doesn't have to be open source for people to stumble upon it when troubleshooting. I've been, in a team and, got a task, didn't know about it, read through some pull requests and soaked up knowledge that way. So this doesn't just happen in open source. But even then, I think framing it that way can help understand what can we do to make this a better place? What can we do to be more kind to people? What are the things we're overlooking? Something to note as well is that something like Git might be mostly forever. Certainly seen code bases where, the software managing system change from like Mercurial to Git, for example, or from SVN to Git. But the history of that code is pretty much forever. But then your pull request environment may not be. Moving away from, Bitbucket to GitHub is probably impossible, or at least very difficult, to make sure that your pull requests join you and make it over to the other website or web service. So you probably do want to keep an eye on that, where if questions have been asked in the pull request review or something has been pointed out, then maybe that's a point where you might leave a comment in your code, right? In your commit as a response to that comment, and explain, this is why we've made the decision to do this. And of course, your Git messages can also be a good place for this. But just realize that pull requests may not be forever, unfortunately. A note maybe somewhat connected to the open source thought experiments, but avoid certain derogatory words like, oh, we can simply do this, or we can just do that, or we can easily change this over to that. Because while you may think that way, and perhaps the author may think that way, not everyone does. And probably in the future, someone will have a question about this. And these words don't really add things, right? We can simply build a new app, or we can build a new app. We can easily replace this API, or hey, we should look into replacing this API because it's been deprecated. The tone of voice just completely changes to a more positive one, and that benefits everyone. So try to notice these kind of words, and this is a great thing to do in rereading your pull request review, and just try to see what a sentence looks like without it and remove them if possible. While I was preparing for this talk, I saw a quote from Aaron Hillegas that some of you might know. The most important thing is to do interesting work with good people. And thinking about this, like, such an obvious thing in hindsight, perhaps, but I thought I'd include it just to think about this a bit and figure out what we can do to, make ourselves positive about the things we're working on, make ourselves proud of the things we're working on. Shape your product, right? Like, figure out how you want to build things, how you want to do things, make it shippable, make it fun to work on. And otherwise, you're kind of doing yourself and the team a disservice. And then I think the most important thing, and I wanted to keep it at the end just to make sure this is in your memory, point out the good things. If you see something that you really appreciate, that you really like, that you hadn't seen before, but learn from, point it out. People arguably do not point out the good things enough. And we're not talking about just reviews here. This applies to everything. Send that card to a friend, right? Just send that message. Reach out to people and share kindness. Share good things. And it'll really make an impact. Thank you. And have a great conference.